Welcome, everyone. This is Songyul Choi. Today, we're delving into a fascinating interdisciplinary topic: Jesus, the mustard seed, and the rock. A philosophical and literary thesis. Our central question is this: can a thesis truly be written, exploring these seemingly disparate themes? We will investigate how combining philosophy and literature, and specifically applying the law of excluded middle, can forge a unique and compelling direction for such an argument. So, let's unpack that central question. Is a thesis combining these elements truly possible? Our approach will weave together three distinct yet interconnected perspectives. Firstly, through philosophy, we will apply the law of excluded middle as a rigorous logical framework to analyze these profound theological and literary symbols. Secondly, from a literary standpoint, we'll undertake a deep reading of the allegorical and narrative dimensions of both the mustard seed and the rock, treating them as complex literary constructs. And finally, theologically, we will ground our entire argument in the biblical figure of Jesus, positioning him as the unifying referent that brings both symbols into cohesive meaning. Let's begin with the allegorical binary Jesus and the mustard seed. Our allegorical reading suggests that Jesus, as the Savior of the world, directly embodies the vital and magnificent tree that grows from the tiny mustard seed. While this is allegorical, the power of this binary combination is that it can become identical. The pairing of Jesus and the mustard seed isn't just metaphorical decoration. Our argument posits that the two terms of this binary, the seed and the Savior, collapse into one another through the powerful logic of allegorical identity. This leads us to the profound concept of the grain of wheat that dies death as multiplication. The position is simple, yet radical. If a grain of wheat dies, it bears much fruit. In the same way, Jesus dies and saves many people. This is the core theological logic that undergirds our entire allegorical structure. Death, in this context, is not negation, but multiplication. Here, the law of excluded middle is challenged, as the seed is neither simply alive nor simply dead, but passes through death into a greater, more abundant life. To break it down: 1, the seed dies. 2, it bears much fruit. 3, Jesus dies. And 4, many are saved. Turning to Matthew 13, we examine the parable of the mustard seed as support for Jesus. While this parable is traditionally understood as describing the kingdom of heaven, doesn't it ultimately support and point directly to Jesus himself? Our thesis argues that this kingdom parable is, in fact, inseparable from the person of the king. The mustard seed's growth from a tiny speck into a great sheltering tree is not merely a description of the kingdom's expansion, but a powerful allegory of Jesus' own trajectory from small, despised, and buried to vast, sheltering, and life-giving. Our key thesis point is that the mustard seed parable functions simultaneously as a kingdom parable and a Christological allegory. These two readings are not mutually exclusive. Rather, by the logic of the law of excluded middle, they are identical in their ultimate referent. Now, let's turn our attention to the second major symbol, the rock. Moses strikes and the kingdom is seized. This theme mirrors our previous discussion. When Moses strikes the rock, this act signifies a violent, urgent seeking. The kingdom belongs to those who seize it by force. This leads to our second point. The kingdom of heaven belongs to those who press into it. This isn't passive reception, but active, even forceful pursuit. And thirdly, the object of this intense pursuit is the search for the water of life, the living water. Crucially, the living water is Jesus. The content of this vigorous seeking, this pressing in, is the search for that living water. And this living water, we assert, is Jesus. Here, just as with the mustard seed, the rock and Jesus are collapsed into a single referent through the same allegorical logic. The rock that Moses strikes is more than just a geological formation or a historical event. It is a type, a figure, a forward-pointing symbol whose ultimate referent is the person of Jesus Christ, the source of living water. So, we have the rock, struck by Moses in the wilderness. From it flows the living water. And finally, Jesus, who is the ultimate identity of this living water. Building on this, we see the rock as foundation building the church. The act of building the church upon the rock follows precisely the same logic. If Jesus is the cornerstone, then the rock isn't just a part of the foundation. It's the foundation stone, the starting point, the ongoing process, and the ultimate completion of the church. The rock, in this context, is not merely one element among many in the church's construction. It represents the entire trajectory of the church's existence, from its very beginning to its glorious end. This brings us to the core philosophical contribution, applying the law of excluded middle to allegorical identity. Classically, for any proposition P, the law of excluded middle states that either P is true or not P is true. There is no middle ground. A thing is either A or not A. Applied literally, this would mean the mustard seed is either Jesus or it is not Jesus, and the rock is either Jesus or it is not Jesus. However, our thesis argument proposes something different. The binary combination can, in fact, be identical. The allegorical reading collapses the distinction. In the profound logic of typology and allegory, the mustard seed is Jesus, and the rock is Jesus. The excluded middle, in this framework, becomes the very space where theological meaning is made. The thesis proposes that philosophy, through the law of excluded middle, literature, through allegory and typology, and theology, through Christology, can be combined into a unified argumentative framework where apparent binary oppositions like seed and savior, or rock and redeemer, ultimately resolve into a singular identity. In conclusion, to answer our initial question, is a thesis on Jesus, the mustard seed, and the rock possible? The answer we propose is a resounding yes, and here is our unified thesis. First, the mustard seed allegory establishes that Jesus, as the world's Savior, embodies the vibrant, magnificent tree that grows from the tiny mustard seed. The Matthew 13 parable, though seemingly about the kingdom, unequivocally supports Jesus himself. Second, the rock allegory illustrates how when Moses strikes the rock, the kingdom belongs to those who actively pursue it, seeking the living water that is undeniably Jesus. Furthermore, if Jesus is the cornerstone, then the rock is the church's cornerstone, its starting point, its journey, and its fulfillment. And finally, the philosophical framework. By combining philosophy and literature and applying the law of excluded middle, demonstrates how both the mustard seed and the rock resolve into a single, unified Christological referent, Jesus himself.